right, welcome to the Teaching That Counts podcast. As always, I'm Abel Maestas. I'm an instructional coach here at Ceres Unified School District. And today we are on our third discussion session about the book Building Thinking Classrooms in Mathematics by Peter Liljedahl. Today I've got a wonderful group of teachers here with me to talk over chapters 4 and chapter 5. We're looking at how we arrange furniture in a thinking classroom and how we answer questions in a thinking classroom. So I'm pretty excited here to be with these four teachers. So I'll let them introduce themselves. So sitting right next to me.
Hello, my name is Peter Liljedahl. I teach Integrated Math 1 and Computer Science.
Hi, I'm Sarah Mucha, and I teach Accelerated Math 2.
Hi, I'm Grant McCormick, and I teach Math 1 at Central Valley.
Hi, I'm Tucker Schwarberg. I teach Math 3 and AP Calculus at Ceres High School.
Perfect. Thank you guys for joining me today. And let's just dive right in and talk about Chapter 4. As we were getting set up here, I know that Tucker had mentioned about just like the first gut feelings you had when you read this chapter on the furniture.
I don't know why Chapter 4 just exhibited the most internal pushback out of all the chapters I have read. It was just moving furniture and just changing up the furniture in the room. And out of everything, all the biggest paradigms, just objectively, it seems like the least intrusive. However, it just evoked the strongest reaction. I don't know why.
Yeah, it reminds me of when I wanted to change my room all the time, like the furniture in my room. But I think he mentioned this in the beginning about how teachers didn't like taking all the furniture out of their classroom. So that's an interesting thing to say.
I'd like to add to that. When I first read the chapter, it kind of gave me some anxiety because I don't know about symmetric. Like things need to be in order. If they're not in order, I feel like I'm out of place. So it's like, wait a minute, I had to be messy with this order. So I had a little pushback too on it.
I agree. I just think as math people, we're kind of, we like things to have order. We like things to have structure. And so it was hard to read. But I do want to try it to see how it would work. I started thinking like, well, where could I move my desk? Or is that even going to work for my classroom? Like just where logistical things are set up. But it was interesting how it said, if your classroom is like orderly and super organized, like it's a negative effect almost on students because they don't want to take a risk because they're afraid of making a mistake. Like it's almost like your room does need to be like organized chaos, so that way that students feel safe to take those risks.
I was really, really bugged me that I had this anxiety and thinking about like why. And I was thinking, because my seating chart and students being in their desk is the main start of classroom procedures and classroom management, and as teachers, that's the first thing that you need to get down in order to help instruction move smoothly. And then I just started thinking about classroom management through instructional design and maybe this paradigm switch of a thinking classroom and students engaging and thinking, maybe that's the classroom management you need. And so furniture and those procedures you're really used to, maybe that can be more lax.
Like the instructional design and the pedagogy is driving the management, not the furniture itself driving the management or the structure, which it kind of almost it's I don't want to say it goes against what we learned when we were in I don't know, teacher school, right, when we were working on our credential. But it definitely makes us think about that. The whole part in this chapter when he showed just the picture of the classroom to the students, and they already made assumptions of what the teacher was like, just by looking at the picture and the structure of the classroom. That was fascinating, and I kind of highlighted that and thought, I wonder if I ask students this question right now, what they would say. And I thought maybe that's a good thought experiment to go out into the high schools and say, hey, what do you guys, here's some pictures. What do you think?
Yeah, because, I don't do a ton of different seating arrangements, but there's a difference between how I arrange my seats for a test and the students come and then, oh, they suddenly remember they have a test, and they know that from the seating arrangement. And so I think there's that quote in there about the way the desks were placed meant that the teacher was never going back to the teaching the way she used to. I think it's really about sending the message. We can have all these pedagogical shifts, but if the students have been doing things otherwise with the current arrangements, they're still going to have some of those bad habits that we'd still like to get out of them.
Oh, very true.
Well, can I add to that? Thinking back to chapter 3, in which we talked about students having a different arrangement every day, that's which I've been applying. It's like on top of that now, the seats have to be chaos for them to kind of like learn more, create that thinking classroom that we've been reading about. I don't know, it just didn't fit right with me, especially too when you see these nice organized classroom where you think the students would come in and say, hey, this is a place where I can think, and it's going to be clean thinking and processing things, not a messy form. But that's what they want. They want a messy form of thinking because the classroom is messy. And then I looked at the pictures too, and I don't know if my classroom or maybe the classrooms that we have will ever even fit that scenario, because I feel like creating groups and trying to expand things with tables, it kind of creates more, there's less space to sometimes even walk around. And so myself in my classroom, the way I even have things, I'm really having a hard time just navigating and circulating, helping students now. And all of a sudden now it has to be more spread out, groups. So I don't know how comfortable I still feel about it.
Yeah, going back to the previous chapters about the vertical whiteboards, it's almost like it doesn't really matter how your desks are situated because you're really not going to be in those desks. So, but I do agree that, well, even just having furniture that had wheels would make it so much easier. Like when I go from my groups that I have to the seating for a test, it's a pain in the butt to rearrange the desk. And if I forget, I forgot to tell fifth period to move the desk back, like today, I was in my classroom moving desks. So, but I think the whole point is, what are we actually using the desks for? Like, are we just using it to take attendance and then we're doing those vertical whiteboards? But I have the same issue of like, how do I move all the desks to the center and still have room for all these groups along the perimeter and for me to walk around? Like, I'm constantly like trying to find new ways to make it easier.
Yeah, we definitely come into some troubles when we have a class size of 35, and our space is limited. One of the things he mentions in the book is about decentering or defronting the classroom, right? Defronting. I think he even mentions when you first try this, I think it might have been in the FAQs, when you first try this, stay as much to the center of the room as possible to let the students kind of to be far. Oh, that's in the next chapter 6, when we talk about questions. So my wonder, just like you said, Sarah, is can you still have a seating chart or seating arrangement to have the students in them, to get them going, and then once they're in task mode, it's like boom, they're out on the edges of the classroom, and that's where they are. But I think there needs to be some rearrangement. It's also tricky. I think it was an ed tech I was talking to today, and it's tricky when your class has the technology in one area. So your phone is in one area and the internet, like you only have one spot to put your computer. And so it's difficult to like try to come up with this creative rearrangement when you're kind of forced into some of that situation. So I think you were mentioning a little bit earlier, I think when we were setting up about our learning intentions and success criteria, it's like, well, we need to use board space for that. So now that I'm using up board space, where are the students going to work? And he mentions in the book too, if you're going to have the projector on when you're using it, but not have it on when you're not using it. So it's not as easy to just like, I'm going to put the projector and I'm going to put my learning intentions and success criteria up there. And I know a lot of you in the rooms that you have, well, except Elvis. Elvis has like a special TV. He's got TVs all over the place. But you have a projector and a screen that covers part of your whiteboards. And so you can't be utilizing the whiteboard if you have that projector down. So
yeah, you'd mentioned the projector. A colleague of ours had his projector moved off the front of his wall to a whiteboard wall, and custodial staff was happy to do that. So they did that for him. That was one thought that I had. Another thought that I had was maybe still keep my desk like in groups, but just face all the directions a different way, and then to furthermore defront it, moving my desk. And I thought about the phone and I thought about the technology. I was like, okay, what do I really need, for my desk? And really, it's just for the desktop PC. I mean, the phone could be on a wall, wherever in a room. But just trying to take some of these ideas, and I think just how like thinking is supposed to be messy, maybe this whole process is supposed to be messy. Try something. If it doesn't work, scrap it. I think kind of the big idea, right, is shocking the system to where students change up their, kind of habits that they've learned.
Yeah, I thought about putting my desk in the center of the room, but not have like the technology piece there. I don't know. When I think about the technology piece, it's like we were so far ahead, like, oh, students Chromebooks 1-to-1, and now it's like, no, we're going to be on whiteboards. So it's like I feel like we're almost going backwards. Not backwards, but like we're saying we don't necessarily. Yes, we have the technology and it's great, but let's go back to like what actually, like, don't reinvent the wheel type thing. I think moving the projector would be an interesting thing. I wonder if the custodial staff at our site would do that. That would be. I also have just like I have a storage room in my classroom, and it's like I should just put my filing cabinet inside the storage room, or like move things into the storage room to like create more space. And the defronting piece with like adding things, like adding a clock on every wall, like I didn't think about that. But then also students would need to know how to read an analog clock. So like maybe that's like a lesson in itself. So those were just some of the things that I was toying with.
To add, I remember when I first got into my classroom and there was just desks and they're pointing towards a white screen. And it's like, this is awesome. I'm finding a teacher. I'm finally get going, right? But it wasn't ideal for me because each desk was separated. Students were sitting next to each other. So the next week I came in and I put teachers together. I grouped them by 2. And I was like, you know what? I still want students to be in groups bigger. So I ended up doing groups of 4. And following year, I actually ended up getting tables. I was like, awesome. I no longer need these desks, but I got these tables where students can collaborate and talk. Push it forward 3 years later, I get this nice big TV, 85-inch TV, which is like, now I have a projector and a TV. What do I do with the projector? And then actually moving that projector to the other side of the classroom while the TV was the frontal face. And students were looking at TV, but I was looking at the projector, so then it allowed me to see what I'm writing on the screen while also looking at students and making sure they're paying attention. That's the way I took it. And eventually said, the projector's not for me. It should also be for the students to look at. So I ended up moving the TV and projector where they were adjacent to each other. And that kind of helped a lot more students because they were a lot closer to TV or they were a lot closer to the screen. They were able to see and follow directions or at least write down the notes. And like, well, these are, I can't see because I'm way too behind or I'm behind in the class. Or I need glasses, and maybe I had like 5 kids who were already in the front. So that really kind of like changed things up. And now that I'm in this idea of how do I create this classroom where I can use the projector and TV, it has really come into this limbo. Like, how am I going to be able to adjust my classroom to both help me, my students, and be a little bit chaotic and still have that walking space so students can see everything. So it's still a lot of work, but it's getting there.
All right, so clearly there's some stuff to think about with rearranging your rooms. I think you gave the listeners, though, a lot to think about in terms of some of the strategies that we could use to defront our classroom and think about especially how we can get around our classrooms to be able to hit all the groups when they're in groups and they're up doing the test. So let's move on to Chapter 5, and Chapter 5 will take a kind of a shift from the way our classroom's set up to how we answer questions in a thinking classroom. And at first, as I was reading this, and he brings up these 3 types of questions that students ask, the proximity questions, the stop thinking questions, and the keep thinking questions. And as I reflect back to the types of questions students ask, they're almost always the stop thinking questions. They're almost always like, did I get this right? Or I just want to not do this anymore. Just give me a reason to stop. So I find it's going to be difficult to find a way to get them to continue. What types of things, while you guys were reading this, really stood out in terms of those three types of questions that students ask and how you can answer those?
Yeah, I think ultimately the way that we answer the questions is what we give the question an energy in how we answer it or don't answer it, as the book says we could potentially be doing. And if we're answering questions in a way that makes students stop thinking, then they see that as their out and they keep asking those questions. And so by not energizing those and having other ways of reactivating them in the learning process by, I really like those 10 questions that have showed up on page 89 and 90. Are you asking me or are you telling me? And answering questions with questions. I think that's really interesting because it continues the thinking. They're used to having questions go in a way that would they're used to having questions continue their thinking, and so by answering with a statement, of course they're going to stop thinking there.
Yeah, I really liked this chapter. The keep thinking questions. I mean, that's always been my goal, is to keep students thinking or just to find their answer on their own. So I've always been a big proponent of answer the question with a question, or answer the question with what their metacognition should be. Like, what checks do I need to do? Okay, I do this, then this informs me this. And just reading this chapter today, I was like, okay, I'm not going to answer their questions. I'm going to answer their question with a question. And it felt so good when a student answered her own question without me answering their question. I just kept posing questions, going backwards through the scaffolding process of what they should know, which leads to this, which leads to this. And it was such a great feeling. And then I ran into the situation where they're like, sometimes these are really going to test you. Like, some students are just going to keep asking questions where it's going to be extremely painful for you. And I found myself at the point where I was just like, I'm going to smile and I'm going to walk away. And that was really great. So
I love the smiling and walking away technique that he talked about in there. What really, once they get used to this, I remember students asking a question and then sitting there and then asking another question and then sitting there and thinking, and they go, oh no, okay. Then they get, and I didn't do anything. I just walked by and looked at them, and just my presence helped them think through whatever they were doing. And I think that's what we strive for, is just for them to really get to that point where they're really thinking through things and scaffolding in their own minds to get the answer that they're looking for.
As I was reading this, I was like, okay, I'm just gonna, next day at work, I'm just gonna see if I notice any of this. And it was like, one kid would raise their hand, or I would be circulating the room, and I felt like I got so many proximity questions, and I was like, oh my God, what is happening? It was weird. And also the fact that it says that teachers answer, or they get 200 to 400 questions in a day. I'm like, no wonder when I get home I'm brain fried, or I don't want to answer anyone's questions or answer my phone. It's because my brain has been working so hard. Yeah, I do like the prompts here. I do feel like I don't have a great poker face when it comes to students asking me questions, and I want to give them the answer. So then I like the smile and walk away aspect, but then I'll start hearing kids be like, well, she raised her right eyebrow, so I think that we're on the right track. Or I think she did this, so and last time she kind of laughed, so maybe that wasn't the right thing. And playing into my facial expressions, or how I tried to not answer them. So I'm interested tomorrow when I do vertical whiteboards and I'm seeing what they know and just smiling and walking away, how they receive it. But I do see how that could be irritating for some students. So I did like, I think towards the end they talked about, not telling kids up front why you're doing that. Like, do it for a couple weeks and then tell them why. Because if you tell them up front, it's almost like you're asking for permission. And I thought that was insightful. Like, a lot of these things I'm reading this book and I want to tell my students, like, hey, so I read that, like, I'm supposed to defront the classroom. What do you think about that? Or, they were talking about a teacher at our site that has the clock covered up. And so I was thinking, like, oh, would that be considered like defronting your classroom too? Like, instead of adding more clocks, like removing the clock, is that a way to defront the classroom? Or like put more projectors and I don't know. Like, it was just an interesting take how they were even talking about the clock.
It did have me thankful, though, that I teach high school students, because reading the section on about a 6-year-old asking a question, they will just keep asking you that question over and over and over again. Having a 5-year-old of my own, and just that visual of them following the teacher around like little ducklings just was pure comedy on pages 90 and 91.
So, I teach Math 1 and Computer Science, and when I was reading this chapter, that really kind of separated my two courses as a completely different atmospheres. In math, I'm always getting these questions asked, like, why do we do this? Why is the process? Where do I sit? Like, all these random questions. Why in computer science, student asks a question, and all I have to do is look at the rubric, and it just answers the question, and I can easily move forward without having to like really do any thinking myself. And they say, oh, okay, that's what I'm supposed to do. I was like, how come I haven't done this in math yet? So I'm going crazy because I need a rubric where students can just look at something like, that's what I need to do. But it also needs to be an easier process where students can say, I don't get this. Where can I go and kind of understand this concept? I'll give you an example for computer science where students need to create a function that allows them to move their variable up and down, which we call it a sprite. And if they don't know how to do that, they can easily refer back to a previous lesson that they have coded and like, this is what I'm supposed to do. This is how I do it. And they go back and do it. While in math, it's like, okay, I don't know how to do this. Where do I go back and get that support right away instead of asking the teacher? So I'm trying to figure out, is there a way where students can just go in, get the answer they need, now they can apply for something else?
And this chapter caused me to think of, like, when I'm giving a test, how many kids want to ask me questions to see if they're on the right track during a test? And they're asking for that, for the validation, because that's what I give them in ordinary lessons. That's what I use to get them to hopefully keep thinking at times. And they're really wanting. The book mentions that they really want to have their questions heard, not necessarily answered. And I feel like I'm always trying to answer the questions, but really what I need to be doing is focusing on how do I make sure that the questions feel like their question has been heard. And there are times where I should answer that, but then there's those times where the smile and walk away is really the way to go. And getting them to have that discourse with their groups, it says towards the end of this chapter, that like, well, did you ask your group? What did your group say to this question? I think that just really taking the burden off of us is really the key forward to getting that thinking classroom, because otherwise it's the teacher doing all the thinking.
So just really quick, so our listeners can understand our verbiage here. So proximity questions are questions that students just ask because the teacher is close, right? They're really close to them, so they're going to ask them questions. Is this right? Or what do you think of this? And they wouldn't go out to ask you the question. A stop thinking question is usually like, is this right? Or why do we have to learn this? Or things that would allow them to really just stop their thinking and just move on. And keep thinking questions are really questions that allow students to move on with their thinking and go to kind of the next level and to kind of continue working through the task. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about those three types of questions. To go back to Elvis's point, I think it'll be interesting once we get to the chapter on notes, where how students can go back and refer to those notes to be a place where they can go and go back to say, oh, okay, now I remember how to do this. And also in this district, we're working on proficiency scales. That might also help as a rubric level, so they can go back and go, oh, this is what I have to be able to do. So maybe those proficiency scales can work in that case too. So I'm excited to get those out to you guys at some point soon. Any other thoughts on this chapter before we wrap up today?
I just wanted to add, Sarah was mentioning earlier that section about discussing what you're doing with the students and communicating why you're doing that. And I feel like that's also been a theme that's come back in selecting the random groupings, because the kids thought that were thinking that I was rigging the deck and I was purposely putting students together because I was passing out the cards to them initially. But then once I let them pick their own cards and they realized that there was no trick to it, I think that idea of, hey, I'm doing this for a reason. I'm doing this because the research says that this is the best way to get you to do what you need to do. I like that idea. That just seems like it's been a theme throughout the book. That imagine that we're more clear with our students in what we're doing, success criteria, and providing clarity. I think that goes with these practices as well.
Yeah, I don't think that this needs to be a secret. We can talk to the students about what the research says and even check in with them on how they're feeling about it.
Yeah, and one apprehension I did have on this chapter was the idea and interaction with parents. I've just heard stories, or you hear students say, "This teacher never answers my question. They won't answer my question." And I know always to take those, with a caveat or a grain of salt, or that really we're playing telephone. So one of the frequently asked questions was, how do parents react to the teacher not answering questions? And I think that's sometimes it's just going to require a conversation, or eventually maybe an explanation, back to school night or something, just communicating to them, that you do answer questions, but you're really trying to build thinking and student ability with the questions that you do answer.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It's like when we start answering questions, we're taking away their thinking. And I think Abel and I had talked about this. Like, you teach something first period and you're like, oh, well, they didn't know how to do X, Y, and Z, so let me front load second period with X, Y, and Z so I don't have to answer those questions. But when we're doing that, we're taking away their thinking. And so I thought that was like a really powerful conversation, because it's like, I don't want to take away their thinking, and I want them to struggle through it, because they are going to remember that experience and it's going to stick with them a little bit more.
All right. Well, it was great to sit with the four of you and talk through chapters 4 and 5 in Building Thinking Classrooms, looking at the seating arrangements and how we arrange our classroom, and also the types of questions that we answer for kids. I'm pretty excited about our next time we meet. We're looking at the next couple of chapters. So join us next time when we talk about chapters 6 and 7 in Building Thinking Classrooms. And thank you for joining us. Thank you, everybody. See you next time.